Hi! I'm making a roguelite based around drawing in Godot. In my last devlog, I created the player and item systems. If you want, you can go back and watch it, but you should be fine watching this one first. I've already made a Google Sheet of enemy ideas for my game, so I can use that to get an idea of what my enemy system needs to do. The enemy I've chosen to create in order to test my systems is the guard. Guards will be a common enemy that use a shield and a spear to stab at the player. As they take damage, they will lose their shield and their armor. I started off by making some sketches of the visual design of the guards. Once I had an idea of what looked fitting, I drew a more detailed final draft. I kept everything on separate layers to make changes easy later. I then decided to shorten the legs of the guard, which was easy due to the separated layers. I exported each of the components individually and imported them into Godot. When making the item system, I made a shader that can change all perfectly grayscale pixels on an image to a specific color, so I used that here too. I also made the guard's shield and spear and added those. Then I set up the guard in game and added some platforms for later testing. The guard is an inherited scene of a more general platformer enemy I can use for other enemies. With this setup, I started making the movement system. First, I tried to use Godot's Navigation Region 2D and Navigation Agent 2D. I drew in the region for the navigation and added basic movement to the Navigation Agent 2D. Unfortunately, there were a lot of issues. First of all, the guard is flying, which may be the behavior I want for other enemies, but not this one. To fix this, I made the pathfinding only control horizontal movement, and I made the enemy jump when the path was over 45 degrees, if they're allowed to. Although this works well for basic movement, the guard can still easily get stuck when more complicated pathing is needed. At this point, I realized Godot's navigation system wasn't going to work for a platformer. I was going to have to make my own. To make it work, I created a list of navigation points that can be used to create paths. I set this list up to be based on each room, which will help me when I make the map generation later. I want to make sure this navigation system can easily be used for other enemies, so I'm creating it in a separate class, which will be attached to a child node of the enemy. The enemy movement will also be a separate node. This is an object-oriented programming concept known as composition, and Godot's node system is made to work very well with this. I also made a base class for the basic navigation and a derived class that does everything that the base class does, but it also accounts for the enemy's limitations due to gravity. This way, I can make other types of navigation systems that don't involve gravity, such as a flying enemy. This is another object-oriented programming concept called inheritance. Anyway, to visualize the navigation system while I'm debugging it, I made the connections and angles be printed on the screen. The purple lines are bidirectional, while the orange lines only go down. After a bit of debugging, I was able to switch the guard to follow this system instead. Going forward, I'll just need to add these points, and the navigation should work. With that all working, I gave the guard movement animations. I used Godot's signal system to make it so I can easily alter how the animations work without needing to alter the movement class or pretty much any code. The next step was to set up the health system. This will be used for both the player and the enemies. This system involves a maximum health, a current health, and shields that will block one hit. In my last devlog, I made the player attempt to call a take damage function on any object it hits with a weapon. All I have to do now is make one of these take damage functions in the health class. I gave the guard 3 health and 1 shield. With my brush dealing 2 damage, it takes 3 hits to defeat them, because 1 gets blocked by the shield. I used the signals here too. I added signals for when the shield is used, when damage is taken, and when the health runs out. These signals allowed me to trigger another script to fling parts of the guard to visualize health being lost. They lose their shield, helmet, and chestplate. I originally made the flung objects shrink out of existence, but I decided to make an erase effect instead. It took me a while to find the best way to implement the erase effect, but I ended on particles that play an animation. To make these particles appear to erase an object, I used a backbuffer node to make a copy of the render buffer. Then, I used a custom shader to display what the backbuffer copied as the particle's texture. This effectively erases whatever is rendered in between the buffer and the particles. I then made the flung objects be put in between them after a delay, and now they are being erased. I also applied this effect to the guards when they die. To make it clear how much damage an attack dealt, I made the damage numbers float up after each hit. There is also an increased critical damage when midair. I then set up a warning and attack animation for the guard's spear attack. I triggered these animations whenever the player was within range. After that, I set up the hitbox for the guard's spear. When this hitbox collided with the player, it dealt damage to their hitbox. But when they run out of health, it causes some issues. Before I fixed that though, I wanted to make it more clear when the guard is attacking. To do so, I added a particle effect that appears on the spear head. To me, this signifies when there is danger much better. Now, it's time to finish setting up the player's health system. After some brainstorming, I decided to display it using Creative juice! I created the jug in Photoshop and I added the liquid effect using a shader I found on GodotShaders.com. Each time the player gets hit, they lose creative juice, and when they run out, they can't go on any longer because they're out of creative juice. With the concept and juice jug prepared, I began to implement it into the game. I made the color random each time. I also made functionality for it to get longer by splitting a sprite into 3 pieces and duplicating the middle one. I can use this for increases to maximum health later. I finished implementing it by making it match up with the player health using signals. To make it more visually appealing, I made the juice go down gradually and drip out of the spout. The final touch for the player's health system will take inspiration from my previous game, Tomato Soup Splashdown. When players' cans are hit in the game, the soup leaves a mark that fades away. I want to do something similar in Sketchpad Dungeon, but I want the paint to stay until the player's healed. To do this, I will add a sprite to any body parts overlapped by a hit's paint splash, and then mask it to only show up on that part. Since I knew how to do this in Unity, I thought this would be fairly easy, but it turned out to be surprisingly difficult. I ran into several issues, the biggest of them being that the clip children setting in Godot did not seem to work when adding the paint sprite at runtime. This took quite a while to fix, as I needed to code a custom shader to mask the paint. It takes in the mask sprite and transfer information, and then applies its opacity to the mask. I also made it only have partial opacity, so it is clear when there is more paint in one spot. When I was working on accounting for the paint scale, I tried the most extreme case possible. It seemed to work until the player turned around, so I adjusted it a little bit more, and now it looks like this, then this. After quite a few more iterations of that, I finally got it to look right, as can be seen here. Yay! Now, everything is very close to completion, with the only remaining thing to add being death for the player, which should be very simple. So I adjusted the erase effect with the player, then I disabled player movement and returned to the main menu after a delay. Alright, that's it for the guard. Once I get to the content stage, I should be able to reuse these elements to create many different enemies much faster than this one. The next episode will probably be covering map generation and various map mechanics. I may also make some improvements to player movement, but I'm not 100% sure yet. If you want to see that video and any other ones that I make about this or any other game I make, then make sure to subscribe and like. Alright, see you next time!